Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or late good evening, depending on where you are in the world. On behalf of our panelists and moderator, thank you for joining us today on this very timely topic, ESG taking root or on fire. My name is Ted Deutsch, and I am the CEO of Taft Communications. We are a communications consultancy in the US, in New Jersey, right between New York and Philadelphia. Taft, like all the firms represented here today, is a member of PROI Worldwide. Before we begin this session, just a few words about PROI presenting this webinar, and then I'll introduce today's moderator, who will be facilitating the conversation. PROI, it's a network around the world. We're in a unique position with 90 firms covering 165 cities in 60 countries. We're in a unique position to provide very local insights on communication trends around the world, as well as putting them in a global context. We're all independent firms. When taken together, this network is among the top 5 consolidated communication groups in the world. And just to give you a little visual on where we are, you can see that we have extensive coverage on every continent. And of course, today's topics, how companies communicate around ESG, is truly a global topic. It's an area that in recent years has become more prominent and sometimes more controversial on the corporate and the NGO agenda. Fortunately, PRI member firms have a lens on most major markets in the world. That means we can deliver important insights and perspectives on a webinar like this one. And also, we're in a strong position to help clients navigate the changing, the evolving expectations around what they are doing and what they're saying related to ESG. Okay, thank you for that. After opening comments from our panelists, we're going to be taking questions from attendees. So feel free to send questions through Zoom, through the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll curate them behind the scenes. And I want to introduce our moderator today, who has kindly agreed to join this conversation and lead it. He's a very highly respected industry leader in the US and around the world, Dave Arman from 3BL Media. He's the CEO of 3BL Media, which was founded in 2009. 3BL has a fantastic platform that many of you are using or should consider using to distribute ESG content to a global audience of stakeholders. And that can mean investors, the media, policymakers, corporate leaders, consumers, ratings and ranking agencies. I'm going to turn the mic over to Dave to get the discussion going and look forward to seeing you during the Q&A section of the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here in New York. It's a tricky time to talk about environmental, social, and governance topics right now. For those who have been immersed in the world of sustainability for some time, the change of the calendar to 2024 actually means that we only have 6 short years remaining to achieve the 17 closely interrelated United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. They were agreed to back when I used to have hair, actually, in 2015. So 193 countries that were part of the United Nations voted to support the global goals. And this is actually a photograph taken during the UN General Assembly back in September of 2015, when the UN building on the east side of Manhattan was lit up with the global goals. A lot has happened since 2015. You know, there have been some headwinds, let's just put it that way. There's been war, there's been political backlash against ESG. As Ted mentioned, PROI has member firms in 60 countries, and many are participating as thought leaders in today's event. And that's a good thing, because it's a mistake to view the world through a United States lens and expect that you're getting an accurate picture. You know, that we all have different forces economically and politically in our countries, and consumers have more sway in certain areas in some countries, and investors and regulators. So we'll talk about that on today's webinar. Here in the US, the US presidential election is looming, and there's someone who opposes the transition to a carbon neutral economy who's leading in the polls, and that's affecting some large businesses and how they've toned down their public-facing ESG communications efforts recently. I don't think it's a forever thing, but it's a thing short-term in the U.S. Politics aside, though, ESG is, I think I skipped ahead too fast. Let me go back one slide. There we go. This is what I want to show you. This is a slide of data that the G&A Institute, the Governance and Accountability Institute, puts together every year. And they do a good job at figuring out who's doing sustainability reporting mainly among publicly traded companies. And what they found is that in the US, 98% of the largest publicly traded companies, those are on the S&P or the Standard & Poor's 500 index, are now issuing a sustainability report. In Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, has mandated reporting for nearly 50,000 companies starting this year. You've got countries like Malaysia and Singapore and dozens of others that are requiring some level of sustainability reporting. So it hasn't screeched to a halt as some politicians in the US on the right might lead you to believe. And there is actually a price to pay for not being communicative on these topics and not being transparent. There was a poll of CEOs done last year by the Conference Board and one by Deloitte, and they found that attracting and retaining talent was the top internal concern for CEOs. Millennials and Gen Z employees, like my daughters, who are 27 and 25, they won't work for a company that's not purpose-driven. They'll be 75% of the workforce in 2025 as the Gen Xers and baby boomers like me retire. And these workers care a great deal more about sustainability and want to work for a company that has a conscience. So as Ted mentioned, the company I work for is called 3BL. It stands for Triple Bottom Line. These are our clients are companies that on the bottom line, it's not just profit, but it's people, planet, and profit. And we operate a very robust content distribution network that only handles news that sort of falls under the ESG category. No earnings reports and no product announcements. It's really around convincing companies to do an always-on approach to storytelling rather than just put out one sustainability report and then start working on next year's. This is about convincing the world that you're committed to this work, setting goals and achieving them, and being honest if you slip up and have a delay. So last year we did 7,000 pieces of content over our network, and I just thought it might be helpful to share a couple trends. Diversity, equity, and inclusion was the top category, although it didn't grow as fast as it had in recent years. It dropped 2 or 3 points instead of growing at double digits. Where there seems to be a kind of a consensus that it's safer to talk about right now under ESG is how your employees are engaged and how they're volunteering and how they're making the world a better place, showcasing workers, philanthropy and cause communications, and also references to the global goals, the SDGs, all are up in seemingly safe territory to communicate on right now. So I want to get started with the conversation. I appreciate everyone's attendance, and our first speaker today is Ciro in Brazil, where it's actually evening time. So thank you for spending your dinner hour with us, Ciro. I wondered if you might start out by sort of sharing your perspective on thinking about cause marketing and CSR on a global basis.
Thank you, Dave. I run the Imagine Corporativa in Brazil. We are a PR company, and we work strongly in CSR and ESG projects as well. And good day, everyone, in different geographies as well. So the very first question I think we should address is that ESG is a concept with many layers. And the first thing we need to consider is what type of ESG we are talking about. Is it ESG in Nordic countries where basic needs and rights of society have already been addressed, or ESG in certain areas of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, where clean water, food insecurity, basic healthcare, and sanitation still remain huge challenges. To make a difference and build effective connection in the specific markets, companies and brands need to decode the local conditions if they want to be seen as partners on a journey. So good faith is not enough. We can say that the success or failure of initiatives in this area will depend on competent homework. In my homeland, Brazil, many national companies from different industries have established good levels of trust with public opinion and consumers when addressing issues of social interest. Natura is a very good example. For years, this cosmetic company has managed to consolidate a strong image of a brand committed to sustainability in general and the Amazon region in particular. The company develops initiatives in the Amazon region with the aim of protecting the environment and supporting local communities in the responsible exploration of biodiversity, which translates into the production of new cosmetics based on the rainforest ecosystem. At Ambev, leading beer and soft drinks company in this market, more than 80% of packaging comes from recycled and reused materials. And thousands of low-income people in different cities benefit from a well-organized process of collecting used packaging, which is delivered to the company and generate money for participants. Another great example in Brazil is Itaú, the main Brazilian private bank. In early 2020, Itaú announced the investment of $200 million in the fight against the COVID-19. But instead of simply handing the money over to hospitals or health organizations, the bank wisely decided to build a team of high-level experts from the market to decide how to use the money most effectively. It's worth remembering that when the pandemic broke out, the Brazilian government was slow to fight against COVID, and Brazil, with just 2.5% of the world's population, ended up recording more than 10% of deaths globally. Of course, there are many other international campaigns. I will not talk about them. I think everybody knows Real Beauty from Unilever, Like a Girl, P&G, Don't Let Fashion Go to Waste from H&M. So I prefer to talk a little bit more about our reality as a developing country. And long story short, I think that no matter the content or approach, the key points are trust, consistency, connection with different stakeholders. Last week, the World Economic Forum held its traditional annual meeting. This year's motto was Rebuilding Trust, which is appropriate in a world steeped in tension, friction, and conflicts. The global puzzle we see today provides more and more pieces every day for governments, businesses, and organizations to tackle. And regardless its complexity, one thing is certain: walking the talk has become even more important. And the question will be, is my marketing cause or CSR project consistent enough, or could it become a backlash? According to a recent survey by Rep Risk from Switzerland, companies linked to greenwashing tactics also frequently adopt social washing initiatives. In terms of numbers, 31% in the case of public companies. Anyway, it's essential for a responsible brand or company that decisions about cross-marketing initiatives or corporate image are aligned with the organization's persona, Otherwise, a negative result is very likely to occur. At the end of the day, there will always be someone or many people checking our projects to know if it is for real or just a house of cards. My last topic encapsulates in a way or another my previous remarks. I think most of you read about the Bud Light beer crisis last year. The company decided to innovate its marketing by inviting a major digital influencer who is transgender to a campaign. The reactions of many Bud Light consumers were very negative, and a boycott against the brand quickly followed. The company decided to back down, was criticized for it, and ended up losing its position as the number one brand in the market. Without judging pros and cons, the learning here in this case of Bud Light is related to the importance of making consistent decisions and asking the right questions. So, is my company or brand ready to endorse a specific idea or cause? Is the approach connected to our DNA? Is this decision mature enough and makes sense in this current scenario? That's it for the moment. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ciro. Really insightful. We're 15 minutes in, and we've already mentioned Bud Light, so that was I lost the bet. I thought it would happen in the first 10. But very excited to get your perspectives. And I want to introduce myself for anyone who's joined us late. This is the PROI webinar about ESG perspectives from around the world, in case you just may have tuned into the wrong link, but we're happy to have you here. There's more than 150 people online right now from across the world. If you have a question, use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform and go ahead and write it in, and we'll be getting to Q&A after our speakers. Next up is Amy Binder here in New York City and a few miles north of Wall Street. Many of your clients are focused on investor reporting and communications. Amy, what advice do you have during this moment in time when virtually everyone is doing sustainability reporting, but where ESG is being attacked in some political circles?
Just to take a global point of view as we start off, and then we're going to focus in more in the U.S., there's no question that using ESG factors in investment decisions is leading to a strong ROI. If you look around the world, the biggest banks have invested $3 billion in 2023 from financing for deals and projects marked as environmentally friendly. Banks have helped raise $583 billion in green debt in 2023. And in Europe and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, ESG-related assets have grown more than 20%. So certainly outside the United States, there's an acceptance from a financial perspective that it's very important. Now, there's no question that navigating the net zero economy has become more complicated over the past 12 months, but companies are staying committed to taking action. And if we zero in on the U.S., as Dave said earlier, given our election year, there are more problems here than probably anywhere else in the world, which is unfortunate for us living here. Dave had this on his slide too. The latest dirty word in corporate America is ESG. What's happened is politically here, people are focusing on the concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. But that isn't stopping CEOs from doing the right thing. 8% of CEOs are ramping down from their ESG programs from last year, but 92% are staying the course. And the majority of CEOs know that they have to be concerned, particularly with sustainability issues in the environmental area. What they're doing is they're not using the terminology ESG anymore. So mentions of ESG on earnings calls has gone down significantly. BlackRock, which took the leadership role on purpose in ESG, is intentionally not talking about it anymore, but so is State Street and Fidelity. And in general, many of the large banks are not using that terminology anymore. And there have been here some outflows in the United States, $13 billion of outflows from ESG funds and investment vehicles. But in some cases, it's hard to tell, is that the political pressure or because of performance of those particular states? And, again, one of the challenges that we face here in the US is that it's become highly politicized. So we have in Texas and in Florida, for example, it's been made almost illegal to use ESG in investing. They've argued that ESG criteria are nothing more than a fad, and it's coming at the expense of the fiduciary responsibility. And across the U.S. during 2023, about 2/3 of the state legislators have considered anti-ESG legislation, but only 14 states have enacted it. So for the most part, as legislators have looked at this issue, they've actually seen that ESG factors are very, very important in what's going on in terms of investment decisions. So, part of this is when we take a look at the political reality of whether or not it's having an impact. Is it politics or is it corporate? How are the politics affecting what corporations and financial services institutions are doing? 67% of bankers, money managers, and other financial market participants are continuing to incorporate ESG metrics. Companies, as you saw from earlier from what Dave is saying, are increasingly issuing reports, because if you're a public company, you don't issue a report, then it's going to be hard for the funds to find you and know whether or not they should be investing in your stock. So issuing the reports, we say to companies, particularly those that are public, is critical in terms of large institutional investment funds and they're making decisions. And money managers are continuing to launch new funds. So it's not like the initiation of new funds in the ESG area have stopped. They're continuing to launch them. And the IRA Act has spurred $213 billion in clean tech investments. So in reality, when you look at it, there's a lot of noise here in the United States. Corporate CEOs and CFOs are being very careful about how they talk about the issues, but it's actually not stopping them from doing the right thing. And the impact of regulation is expanding ESG opportunities here, like in many other countries around the world. It's important to consider the regulation that will be a major factor in shaping the future of ESG, so there isn't greenwashing, so people can really understand what's real and what's not real. There's going to be more pressure on corporates from investors as the SEC is expected to finalize its proposals on climate change disclosures later this year. But this has been going on for a long time. I remember those of you may know SASB, it's one of the ratings agencies. When they were first launched, Mary Shapiro, who was the head of the SEC, and Michael Bloomberg, who was the chairman of SASB. And I had a conversation with Mary Shapiro when I was writing an op-ed for her, and she said, it is material what you're doing in the ESG area. You have to report. So yes, the SEC is going to finalize its proposal, but there's been a lot of pressure for quite some time on companies to do the reporting. So if there are 4 takeaways that I would say from a financial perspective, conceptually, ESG is going to be here to stay. The IRA and expected SEC climate disclosure rulings signal positive momentum. It may not be under the guise of ESG. It may not be talked about under those 3 letters, but the fact is that people are going to still doing the right thing. Investors and executives are without question backing the concept of ESG, maybe not the terms, but they know that it brings real shareholder value when they take a look at ESG factors, particularly in the environmental area. It's funny that the term has become such a lightning rod, but those in the financial markets will continue to find ways to talk about it and communicate it, maybe, again, not using that terminology. And coming also out of Davos, a number of reports talked about CEOs talking about ESG as a business imperative. It is something that companies now need to look at. Countries outside the U.S. and despite all this going on politically here in the U.S., even here in the U.S. So from the capital markets point of view, ESG factors continue to grow in importance.
Thanks, Amy. Great perspective. I want to move next to Ghana, actually, where it's almost 9 at night there. So thank you for spending your evening with us. Baba Kofi leads the agency Mahogany. And during our prep calls, Baba, you have emphasized that communication around sustainability and CSR, corporate social responsibility, is really an exercise in community and stakeholder relations. So I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about your approach and the advice you give your clients.
Thank you so much, Doug. So yes, for as long as I have worked in communication, CSR has always been the biggest part of community and stakeholder relations. And I'm going to drill down a little bit. I mean, for us at Mahogany, we focus a lot on strategic CSR. And so let me move my slide one bit up. Yes. So we focus a lot on strategic CSR. And so in Ghana and many parts of Africa, we realize that CSR is approached by many organizations in an ad hoc manner. So what we advise clients is to approach it from a strategic manner, aligning it definitely with your values. That is one. And then also from the community's point of view, using research and insights from the community to engage them in a manner that they feel empowered, so that they feel they are driving the community relations with you. CSR, of course, intends to improve the quality of life for business stakeholders. These include employees, clients, communities. They are supposed to be strategies that companies use to take more responsibility for their impact on society and the environment. However, in Ghana and in most parts of Africa, we come from a culture where everybody is responsible, for instance, for the upbringing of a child in our community. So we have a proverb, for instance, that says that it takes a village to raise a child. So when organizations find themselves in this kind of socio-cultural landscape, they tend to latch on this to build community relations, which is a huge focus on our CSR activities or on our CSR strategies. Organizations then look for needs and where they could give back to society. And sometimes, yes, it is aligned to the business strategic goals, but sometimes not necessarily. Stories of CSR activities by organizations, multinational, regional, and local, are always publicized in mass media. I remember, for instance, I had to write 5 different angles of one donation story to be placed in 10 media houses. And that is the extent to which organizations use CSR to amplify what they are doing and to enhance community and stakeholder relations. So over time, CSR, yes, has always been a big thing, but over time, organizations also began to consider the extent to which CSR was contributing to their bottom line. Then the concept of CSI, corporate social investment, kicked in. So now companies became sticklers of data analysis and media measuring tools to guide them to make that case, not just for social impact, but more importantly, for equity. However, CSR is still dominant in our society, as I said, due to our traditional beliefs in strong community relations, to the point where quite a number of multinationals and regional organizations have stand-alone departments for community and external relations, especially those in the extractive and telecom space, whose operations are making impact, direct impact on the community. So these community relations teams focus on understanding the cultural nuances of the community. They have a lot of one-on-one engagements, which is critical. There are things like community development projects, there are donations, sponsorships, and other community-driven programs. Community relations in these spaces is the social license that these organizations need. And in Ghana and many parts of Africa, our social license is just as important as your legal license, because the community can actually shut you down if they wish to. And it is part of the reason why community and stakeholder relations is so important. So this is where ESG comes in. Guided by global trends and usually spearheaded by multinationals and regional corporations, the concept of sustainability evolved. And that is the in thing now, currently in Ghana and in most of Africa. So we started talking about accountability, transparency, integrity, responsibility, social acceptance, climate resilience, etc. Now, the concept of ESG, which is the new kid on the block for us, is being driven by sustainability teams with more focus on community relations. Now, in Ghana, ESG is practiced at different levels. So depending on the industry, depending on the level at which the industry is. So multinationals, for instance, especially those in the extractive and telecom business, multinationals in FMCGs and banking and finance, and also SMEs are practicing ESG on different levels. So first of all, I don't think this is not the slide. Let me change my slide again. Okay. So first of all, the multinationals in the extractive business tend to have very strong sustainability departments that drive ESG, still with a huge focus on community and stakeholder relations. And that is at the heart of our ESG and SDG agenda. They also constantly communicate about their local content policies. They look at their environmental stewardship, which is becoming critical. Their taxes, for instance, how they are contributing to society. Some of these ESG communication strategies are also, of course, very important investor relations tactics, which is a consciousness which is now being grown, especially among regional organizations and even SMEs. The second group of organizations I'll talk about are also multinationals and regional organizations that find themselves in spaces such as the FMCGs and banking and finance. Currently, for instance, our central bank in 2019 launched a policy to encourage sustainable banking. And now we are seeing a lot of banks pushing ESG agenda. And this has become an in thing to the point where they are recruiting communicators who have sustainability background. The bigger draw for some of these banks also is to attract development finance institutions for investment. The last group would be SMEs, local businesses, who are now learning about environmental stewardship and other ESG benefits. Some are now even thinking about ESG. Some are now hearing about ESG, and some still don't know about ESG. And these form majority of businesses in Ghana. But despite all these strides, a lot of organizations are still focused on CSR because it seems to come second skin to us. We are yet to fully embrace environmental stewardship. We are yet to fully embrace global governance, especially for SMEs in Ghana and across Africa. So I would say that ESG is taking roots, but for most organizations, especially local organizations, the seeds are now being sown or going through probably a decay process to begin forming its roots. So let me just conclude by saying this, that in Africa, the relationships between businesses and communities are often very intricate and deeply intertwined. Community and stakeholder relations are central to corporate responsibility and sustainable development. Companies operating in Africa need to understand and address the specific need and challenges of local communities. And this would involve engaging stakeholders, respecting cultural diversity, which is critical, and contributing to the well-being of these communities where they operate. Organizations are gradually setting ESG goals stemming from, of course, the global influence I spoke about. Perhaps companies who are driving the ESG agenda could even guide, communities and smaller businesses to appreciate the concept some more. So the African perspective, if you ask me, Doug, highlights the importance of corporate responsibility, not only as a business strategy, but as a means to foster positive social and economic development in the region. Companies that prioritize strong community and stakeholder relations contribute to building a more sustainable and equitable future in Africa. So I'll end it here, and I look forward to questions.
Baba, really good insights. Thank you. And, specific industries that are dominant in the area certainly have different needs and are pushing our major economic pushes there. So you demystified it for us. We've got some good questions coming in on the Q&A button on Zoom. So we encourage anyone who hasn't posted a question to do so now. One of the questions that was asked is actually about how internal communications and employee comms plays a part in communicating, and it's right on topic for our next speaker, who's Josh Dowse in Sydney, where his Friday morning's already begun. And Josh heads up Senate SHJ. So Josh, we know that in order to be consistent in ESG comms, you have to talk to people throughout the organization, and some of them are cheerleaders, and some of them are, kind of challenge priorities. And so how do you square that circle? How do you make ESG a priority for all?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Look, I'd really like to get into those topics. I want to go through how you're going to layer your approach to communicating internally so that you can communicate consistently, both internally and externally. And I also want to go through a couple of the particular frameworks or particular approaches that have been very effective over the 25 years or so that I've been working in this field to get those messages across and build support internally, which is, of course, so important. But first of all, I can't help commenting on all the kerfuffle about the term ESG in some countries in the Northern Hemisphere, across the Atlantic Ocean, from Europe, whatever that might be. The term ESG has sort of taken hold globally because it's so it's so neutral. Before that, there was sort of responsible investing, which implied that everything else was irresponsible, or sustainable investing, which implied that everything was unsustainable, or ethical investment, which meant that 99% of the finance community was unethical. So all of these terms were eventually cast aside to this nice neutral term, ESG, which simply means looking at the non-financial factors, the environment, social and governance factors, and no one could possibly argue with that. And yet here we are in the US, they've managed to argue about that. So we get back to that. But I'm pretty sure, as Amy was saying, that will pass over, and the concepts and the practice of it will continue to build momentum as it has around the world. And it's a fairly irresistible force in that regard because it works. Okay, so that said, how do we take on board the communication challenge of different people in the organization with different agendas, but all of whom you need to bring on board? And apologies, I did want to bring this slide in by parts, but basically you've got three layers, I guess, that you could talk about internally. You've got the C-suite at the top, of course, you've got all of the frontline staff at the bottom, and you've got this murky middle, all the middle management, who have to sort of work their way through that. And for the C-suite, you're trying to get support for the direction of investment. But once you've got that support, you want them to treat any ESG initiative like they would any other investment, with the same parameters, the same sort of responsibilities, the same tracking, the same measurements, building into the same performance reviews of the staff. So you'll get a little bit of skepticism from the C-suite on the value of doing all of this. But basically, I've found that they're the most ready, the people most ready to take this on board. Why? Because they, particularly the CEO and the CFO, they're systems thinkers. They look at the organization as a whole, they look at the industries in which they operate as a whole, and they recognize that anything they do to trade off value in one direction will come at a cost at another direction. So they want to treat things holistically and keep these machines working. There's more skepticism in some of the operational areas, and in particular, funnily enough, in the corporate affairs areas, who are nervous that this might, cause problems externally. But you've got to work through that, and some of the approaches that I use, which we'll talk about in a moment, is firstly the idea of 4 capitals, which is a really strong sort of organizing principle for this. It's very simple to say, oh, well, look, we report on our financials and that's all that matters. But as we'll talk about, there are more capitals in the world. Essentially, we all start with just the earth. That's natural capital. And then we bring our human capital, our innovation and our talents and our energies to that world. And then we bring our social capital together and work together and collaborate and use our reputation to gather more friends and do more things. And with all of that human and social capital, of course, we create manufactured capital and financial capital. So you have to look at all of these things at once. I'll also introduce to you the ESG cycle that we use, a cycle of performance and access to capital, access to those 4 capitals. The most important thing when talking about ESG internally is to always bind it to the core strategies of the organization. You've got a corporate strategy, you've got operational strategies, marketing strategies, brand strategies, whatever they might be. Often these things are quite independent. In the best organizations, of course, they're very well integrated. And your ESG conversation has to support the core strategies of the business. If they don't, they just simply won't get resources and won't be supported. And finally, there are many ways to show hard data on the returns, both of ESG generally and of specific initiatives, and there's many ways of doing that. So you're going to use those approaches to gain support in the C-suite. Dropping down to the staff, they're often the easiest people to get on board, particularly the younger generations, which I'm not included in, obviously. They are very, very well attuned, very well, and expect a lot of their corporations and expect a lot to see themselves as both a citizen and an individual and an employee and a consumer, and not have to divide their lives into those 4 different things. So they want to go to places where they can work and be themselves. And if going to work and being themselves means having certain environmental and social attitudes, then they're happier for that. So the purpose-driven organization is one thing, but it's not only the purpose, it's even if the purpose is fairly prosaic, selling socks, it's how they go about selling those socks. What is the organization like? They have resistance because they think it might just be another top-down corporate fad. It's not genuine, it's not reactive, so they don't take it seriously. So you have to overcome that resistance. So you've got a generally positive audience there, but you have to overcome that resistance with all of the usual tricks of the trade that you've got in internal comms, all of the usual approaches, and treat it as a retail or social media opportunity to build that energy and to build that understanding internally. So that leaves the people in the middle, and they're actually the hardest nut to crack, because they're the ones that are caught in the crunch between short-term performance objectives and these longer, more nefarious, longer-term, ethical considerations, or building up brand, or building up social capital, or building up the quality of their people and their reputation. All of these sort of longer-term sort of issues. And what I've found very useful for them is working through a value driver tree in their organization and for their particular department. So if you can break down if you can break, and I'll introduce what that looks like. If you can break down how their revenues and their costs are made up, and you go back into that, for example, the revenues for selling ice cream might be the number of sales for each person in the day. It depends on the energy of that person and the qualities of that person. Every person is different. How do you motivate that person? If you can motivate them, just by 5%, through some sort of purpose-driven initiative, then you will get that extra return. So you work through those value driver trees. Obviously, if their superiors insist on something, that's going to obviously work. If they're recognised internally, but also through their KPIs and their remuneration, that's going to help, obviously. And most importantly, too, there needs to be support for them. They're pretty much crunched with their day-to-day. This is new for them. They'll need support to bring that to bear. So they're the sorts of things that I'd like to introduce. So very quickly, just two of those things, and we can take them up later if there is time. I just want to introduce this ESG cycle to you, which has been very, very effective in communicating what ESG is all about, overcoming some of that noise and dissonance, etc., that built up in some areas. And ESG is many things. So how do you look at it holistically? So that story starts with what we all know to be the financial capital story, right? So you've got this organization and it has money to spend and it does stuff, right? So that capital and activity is what we're looking at. And over time, it uses and produces more financial capital. So it might run it down, or it might sort of generate profits and deliver that. And that gets measured and recorded as financial data in the P&L and the balance sheet. So that makes sense. And that then gets audited and a narrative is built around it. And usually there's mandatory disclosure for listed companies and public companies of that. And that goes to investors and regulators, and they use that, and the investors either buy or sell shares, and then the company gets access to more financial capital if all's going well, and then they can reinvest that and do more things. So the story sort of picks up in an ESG space when we consider not just financial capital, but all forms of capital that I talked about before, your human, your social, and your natural capital. So what happens then is you've still got that organization at the top, and you've still got that circle, but you've got the impact is affecting both the company's own or the organization's own natural, social, human, and financial capital, because it's using that all the time, but it's also doing that on the communities, societies, national, global, natural, social, human, and financial capital. And the idea, of course, is you don't rob one to do the other. You're trying to do a win-win. But anyway, you can do with the same thing. It's the same story. You can measure that impact. You can build, you've got to audit and verify some of it, but not all of it. You can build a narrative around that, and there's a lot more. There's a lot more flexibility in that narrative that you can build. It's very much to do with the organization, and less mandated, and a lot of it is voluntary, what you have to do, but increasingly that's becoming mandated as well, as we know, particularly in Europe. So, and then the important thing is that's now not just going to regulators and investors, it's going to all stakeholders, investors, regulators, the management itself, so they can see priorities, the employees, customers, suppliers, partners, governments, customers and citizens. And they are then making their decisions on whether or not to share their human and social and natural capital with the organization. A simple case, I mean, you're a tourism operator and you want to get access to a fantastic new national park and be the monopoly resort in that national park. Well, you're not going to get that access unless the government who controls that national park is convinced that you are going to protect and maintain and enhance its natural capital and the social capital of the communities that live around that place. So they're going to decide whether or not you've got access to that capital. And the more of that capital, the more people who join you, the more organizations who join up with your organization, the better. And you'll get not only that, the financial capital, because investors, obviously, as we know, are more and more tilting their portfolios to include these factors. So obviously you'll get more capital from them, and you'll get debt capital, or debt availability at much cheaper rates. But you'll get all of this more important capital as well. And what's
This is
important
a great framework that you're sharing with us today, Josh. I appreciate it.
Okay, there you go. 5 minutes goes very quickly. Thanks, Dave.
It does. You're good? Well,
yeah, I'm good.
This is tied together nicely with a trademark. So let's be careful to attribute it to Senate, but it's a great way to view this. And you have good clients too. I wanted to mention, I'm envious of the ice cream, socks, and tourism operators as clients. So if you have a boondoggle for the press, you invite me. I'll be over to Australia. So Sam Sharp, we need to move the conversation over to London right now. You do much of your work at Lansons on environmental issues, but you've also noted the intersectionality of issues under the ESG umbrella. For example, inclusion, diversity, and equity is linked to climate all over the world. So tell us how you address this with your clients. Sam, you might be on mute.
Sorry, there had to be one, didn't there?
It's okay. You're loud and clear now.
Great.
Good evening.
Hi. So yeah, often DE&I in particular tends to get siloed or farmed out to HR, but really it is an integral piece of that ESG or sustainability puzzle. And at its heart, just like ESG, it's really a leadership behavior and a decision-making framework that should sit at the heart of how business operates. And also, like ESG, that's a DE&I, that acronym, has faced the same backlash, and those three letters have become incredibly loaded and politicized. And we are seeing that a little bit in the UK, but not as acutely as obviously we're seeing in the US at the moment. I'm conscious actually of Dave, your words earlier about being very conscious of not seeing everything through a US lens, but at the moment, a lot of the conversations, picking up on the likes of Google reneging on targets or pulling budgets around this, right the way through to, I think, the likes of Elon Musk blaming the Alaska aviation near disaster on diversity and accusing corporates of sacrificing everything, even safety, onto the altar of DE&I policy. But I mean, Elon Musk is what we would call in the UK an edgelord, in that he sort of scurries to the edge of a debate incredibly quickly to take an extreme position just to stir things up a bit. But it's also becoming increasingly tied, particularly in the UK, to the so-called war on woke. And I think even as, if we're in comms, I think the semantics really matter here. And some of the journeys some of these frameworks have been on. So woke, for example, started in the 1930s in America as a call to awareness. So particularly amongst young Black men, asking them to, be vigilant, be awake, be woke to the reality of being a Black man in a segregated society, be aware of what's around you. Obviously, it's been reclaimed in recent years, and now we tend to use it in a derogatory way to talk about things that are at the extremes of what would sit under EI policy. But ultimately, I think, echoing Josh, ESG, DE&I, woke, they are pithy terms that are now widely understood. And I don't think, even though we may see in a short time frame them being used less in certain places, they're not going anywhere until there is a better replacement. And I don't see any of those on the horizon quite yet. Then, where we have clients where they do want to move away from some of those acronyms, there are other ways of talking about what you're doing from a DEI perspective. The most obvious one is, again, echoing the way many corporates talk about the environmental side, but is to really embed it within looking at the SDGs. And there are 4 that very obviously fit under DE&I. So 5, gender inequality, 8, decent work and economic growth, 10, broader reduced inequalities, and also poor SDG 16, which always gets forgotten, mostly because I think corporates feel it's a little intangible. But if you were to draw an SDG pyramid, you could argue that 16 goes at the top. And if you don't solve that, it's incredibly difficult to crack everything else. Then in terms of how we're working with clients and how we're making sure that DE&I and ESG are all embedded together and, again, mirroring what other people have said, fits within the overall strategy, there are myriad ways in which you can do it and measure it, from hiring and retention policies to full racial equity audits. But one thing we found that works really well is simplifying everything down, even to one single line, and being able to sit down with the client and actually go through, if you're honest, we need to plot 3 parts along this line, like where you think you are, where you honestly want to be, and then look at what you're doing and work out where you actually are. So are you in a position where you're simply playing the rules and doing no harm? Are you beginning to incorporate what you've outlined as your DE&I strategy into how you operate as a business? Or actually, are you in a position to advocate and build change wider than you as a business? And I call out Walmart, actually, not uncontroversially, but as if from a specific DE&I perspective, if you were to look at certain leaders, they are doing some quite interesting things. And then the last slide I'll just touch on, given time, and again it echoes what a lot of people have said, but above all the technical documents, over all the detailed pillars and structures and strategies companies put together, they need to tie everything together, and you can boil it down to a really simple narrative across both DE&I and ESG and look at it all together and be able to articulate what that means in terms of how you operate as a company, how you bring your colleagues with you, which I think is actually the biggest mistake we see companies make and forgetting to do that, how it impacts the customers, how it's embedded within the products and services, and then how it impacts communities. So again, you can simplify it, but if you can't nail a one-page story that you believe right the way across the business that does that, building out everything else is really quite difficult.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. I didn't know that Elon Musk is an edge lord, but I do now, and that's my quotable for the call today. This is good. There've been a couple of questions, but we answered some of them in context, with the speakers. I think there is one question that might be good to ask Josh, since you focus so much on the internal comms issues, and that is, let's say you've got a middle manager in one of your client companies who's potentially an advocate, but also potentially an obstacle in terms of getting, the manager's team to get on board and actually, be supportive of the company ESG mission. Do you have any kind of a playbook for that on how to get middle managers to actually help you in your job as a communicator?
Yeah, and I'd like to hear Sam's views on this as well, because a lot of what she was saying there on that last slide, which was rushed probably due to my going over time, was very much on point on that. So I'd love to hear Sam's view. But it's essentially just patients working on those 4 things, individual conversations, the old story that, they've got to hear about these things from people they trust and not just people that have walked in that day. So building up those collaborators, having those conversations in 2s and 3s rather than the town hall meeting, and building up, doing things not across the board, but doing things or suggesting something that, hey, if you do this one thing, it'll help you reach your quarterly, half-yearly, annual targets. But it'll also help build your longer-term sort of reputation as a manager and as our company. So it's a win-win for that. So they're all the standard communication things that I'd suggest.
Sam, is there anything in the UK that you've seen in terms of working with clients where you get somebody at a mid-level and sort of as a champion, and all of a sudden it just breaks loose and you're successful?
So one thing we've seen work really well is taking a public sector model, which the NHS, so the Health Service Anti-Smoking Campaign, is a bit of a case study here, where you make sure that not only the CEO of the hospital and the head of the trust, and then all the doctors and every single middle management admin layer, right the way down to the porters who were on the street, like every single person understands the message and the role it plays. So it's putting an external lens on it, but actually it's, again, I think echoing Josh's point to the commercials, if you put an external lens on it, somehow it seems to go up the priority stakes.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I hear it from my 25-year-old daughter, who's a female engineer in a tech company, and she doesn't buy what comes from on the top, but sort of employee to employee, they believe one another, and fortunately they have a voice. Well, we're up on time. I appreciate the more than 150 people that listen to this today, and also these great thought leaders from around the world contributing to this conversation today. PROI has a bunch of resources that really are knowledgeable about ESG or CSR or sustainability or impact or whatever you want to call it. But I think you've seen on this webinar today that we encourage you to reach out. The organization I lead, 3BL, similarly, we focus a lot on communication and always on communication on these topics. So, we're here for you, and don't be a stranger. And thanks again for your time today. Take care.
Thank you, Dave.